Hi everyone, we are here with Professor Simone Bertoli, who just presented his work on migration and co-residence choices at the last Novafrica Seminar. Hello Professor, thank you very much for talking to us. So the first thing I want to ask you is if you could give us a brief summary of the project you just presented at the seminar.
Okay, so the project is an empirical project that I have just started with my co-author Elie Murat from ISA in Bonn, and we try to focus on what we think is a neglected aspect in the migration literature, namely the possibility that the migration episode of one household member triggers or is correlated with additional changes in the composition of the household the migrant was originally from. And why we think that this topic that has not yet been explored in the literature is a relevant one? Well, for a few reasons. First is that when we think about migrant origin countries that are developing countries, in these countries we had a huge variety of living arrangements, and the nuclear households that is typical, for instance, in European countries with parents co-residing in mosques with their children is actually the exception rather than the rule in developing countries. There's a huge variety of living arrangements, and these living arrangements might be affected by the migration of one family member. And if this occurs, this is relevant for different strands of literature. The first one is the one that tries to understand what are the implications of migration for the household members left behind. Because this strand of literature usually relies on cross-sectional data collected at one point in time that include retrospective questions on the international migration of members that were, individuals that were household members in the past. And the implicit assumption there is that the migration structure, the household composition is frozen. Except the migration episode, nothing else is happening. But this is potentially problematic because if there are further correlated changes in the migration, in the household composition, correlated with the migration episode, then when we estimate the effect of migration on the household members left behind, we are blurring two things: the causal effect of migration with the correlated changes in household structure. The literature has analyzed a broad array of effects on poverty, education, child labor, and I think that it's important to try and understand whether the existing empirical evidence is actually mixing the two. And the second strand of literature, more recent and growing, for which this is relevant, are the papers that try to analyze who, conditional upon being willing to send someone abroad, who's moving out of the household. So within household selection into migration. We think that defining the relevant decision unit at the household level is potentially problematic. Also because theory tells us that what is relevant in migration decision is not the household, but the family, the broader networks of individuals. And we are trying to explore what are the possible implications of this tension between a focus on the family in the theory and a data-constrained emphasis on households in the empirical analysis.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
This is a very interesting topic, but very difficult to explore. And during your presentation, you highlighted the need to have a panel data and the framework of the question itself. So we wanted to ask you, how would you extend your analysis if you could have more data throughout the years?
So we relied on a panel household level survey, the Encuesta Nacional de Ocupación y Empleo in Mexico from 2005 to 2007. The advantages of this survey is that there's a panel dimension that lasts for 5 consecutive quarters for each household in the sample, and this allows us observing migration episodes and further changes in household composition. But the key limitation, as you mentioned, is the time frame, meaning that we are able to observe changes in household composition that occur around the time of migration, but not much beyond that. And one could actually suspect that additional changes could occur later on in time, for instance, because the income effect produced by the migration of one member unfold, and co-residence choices are likely to be affected by the economic situation of the household. So further action might occur after the period in which we are able to observe a household. So clearly more time would be a welcome a welcome extension, but I think that there are other dimensions in which we face binding data constraints that are worth relaxing. In particular, what we would need is information about the migration episodes of other family members that were not household members. So given that the idea that we have in mind is that the migration of a family member can modify the partition of family members into separate households, we would like to have information on migration episodes not only within a narrowly defined household, but within the broader network of family members. So more time would be good and would probably increase the incidence of further changes in household composition, but I think that more questions would actually be better. We need really to observe something at the family level, but we use household level data, so there's a bit of tension there.
Exactly. And the results you found at the end of the study, did they match the expectations you had in the beginning?
Yeah, actually, I take the answer is yes, and I think that this is also the justification for my behavior with my co-author that was already working on this data, and I told him repeatedly, listen, we need to find time to start this with the Mexican data because I can bet the ranch that we're going to find this result, a major correlation between migration episodes and further changes. He was under a lot of time pressure on other projects, but in the end, he received so many emails on me on this topic that he was convinced to write the first 2 files, and he was happy because in the end I proved right. So there's a huge correlation in the data. Whether it's causal or spurious correlation is something that it's still unclear and will actually hopefully become clearer when we proceed further with the analysis. But I would say that in a broad sense, yes, we do find something that was consistent with the expectation, although what was a bit puzzling and I thought with the expectation was the comparison of the characteristics of the new members that joined the household with the members that were already there before, because we actually expected new members to be less educated than previous members, but this is not the case. Actually, there's a significant difference, but that goes in the opposite direction. I think that in order to understand why this is the case and why this is at odds with our initial conjectures, we need to understand better what is the relationship between the identity of the migrants and the identity of the new members that join, because the two are probably very closely correlated, and so we need to understand the relationship between the two better.
Okay, and the final question, we would like to know in what way could the migration survey take into account the implications of this project? Okay,
so here you are pointing towards the first best, which is, well, you design your own survey and you use these in the data from the survey in your analysis, because usually what we do is that we use second-hand data that have been collected for different purposes, and then this creates problems. If I had the opportunity to design my own panel survey, I think that the direction to be taken would be similar, although a bit different from the one that was taken in the Cape Verdean survey that was underlying the paper on the JV by Katia Batista, Aitor La Cuesta, and Pedro Vicente in 2012, where basically they asked the household head to report about past migration episodes, not within the household, but in a sense within the family, because the household head was asked about past migration of his or her spouse, if he or she was absent from the household at the time of the survey, and also about the past migration episodes of all of these children, irrespective of co-residence choices, so irrespective of whether they were co-residing or not at the time of the survey. I think this is the good direction to take. I think that I would expand this a little bit further, also asking about the migration episodes of the same generation, meaning brothers and sisters of the household head. Because I think that what we are observing is that, and this is also can explain why new members are younger, if there's a couple with children, one of the two spouses leaves, the one that is providing support is not necessarily a parent, a grandparent, but possibly an aunt or an uncle of the children. So the same generation, possibly younger and possibly unemployed individual in the same family.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. My pleasure.